Today we're going to talk about the mysteries of New York and try to understand what might be hiding behind the official timeline. According to the commonly accepted version, the history of the modern metropolis begins in 1613. That was when a ship belonging to a Dutch merchant named Adrian Block reached the shores of the territory we now know as New York. However, the fate of this expedition was dramatic. The ship burned down, leaving the crew at the mercy of the unknown. The crew was forced to go ashore. Official sources claim that the local inhabitants, the Native Americans, showed incredible hospitality. They supposedly helped the captain and his men survive the harsh winter by providing food and even offered technical assistance in building a new ship so the Dutch could return home. The city's history has barely begun, and we're already facing facts that raise serious questions. How exactly could a team of sailors, together with the indigenous population, build a new vessel capable of crossing the ocean? Let's think logically. A 17th century ship was an extremely complex engineering structure. Building one required a shipyard, seasoned dry timber, a forge to make nails and fastenings, fabric for sails, tar, and a wide range of specialized tools. The technologies available to Native Americans at the time were limited to dugout boats or bark canoes. These were light river craft, not seagoing vessels. To claim that people who had never seen blueprints and did not possess European-level carpentry skills could help build a complex sailing ship without proper training or equipment is, to say the least, naive. Could you assemble a car in the forest with nothing but an axe, and help from people who had never seen a wheel? Most likely not. This episode is the first warning sign that we're being told a carefully edited fairy tale rather than real history. Still, the new lands appealed to the Dutch. In 1614, they founded a colony, and in 1625, new families from Holland arrived on Manhattan. In that same year, historians say, a fort was built to protect the settlement. If you also notice these glaring inconsistencies in history textbooks and want to know the truth, subscribe to the channel right now and hit the like button. Your support helps us promote these investigations so we can dig even deeper. Surviving and building a ship already sounds miraculous, but what happened next raises even more questions. We're approaching the moment when a permanent settlement is supposedly founded, and here the scale of inconsistencies becomes truly enormous. If building a wooden ship in the wilderness seems unlikely, then constructing the first permanent fortifications and defensive structures defies all the construction and economic logic of that era. Let's take a close look at the official numbers and compare them with the amount of work that was supposedly done by a handful of settlers. In 1625, new families from Holland arrived on Manhattan. Historical records don't give an exact number, but even the most optimistic estimates speak of about 100, at most 150 people. And we're told that in just 1 year, these people, burdened with the daily struggle for food and basic survival on wild land, built a full-fledged fort for defense. By 1628, according to censuses, the population of the new Netherland colony was only 270 people. That number includes women, children, and the elderly. There were barely 100 able-bodied workers. And yet historical city plans from that time show not a simple wooden palisade, but a powerful defensive structure, the famous Fort Amsterdam. Moreover, the maps clearly show the layout of a so-called star fort, with its characteristic geometrically precise bastions. Who could have designed and built such a complex engineering structure in the middle of nowhere? Where did they get brick and stone? Did they really ship construction materials across the ocean on wooden sailing ships along with food supplies? Or did 150 people somehow organize brick production, stone quarrying, and large-scale construction while also farming and hunting? This leads to another logical dead end. Who exactly were these massive walls and bastions built to defend against? Official history says relations with the local population were based on trade. The famous deal to purchase the entire island of Manhattan from the Native Americans for $24 took place in 1626. People actively exchanged goods, and the main export to Europe was beaver pelts. The picture looks strange. On one hand, peaceful trade and mutually beneficial exchange. On the other, the construction of cyclopean defensive walls, one of which later gave its name to the famous Wall Street. The economic model of this settlement raises no fewer questions than its construction. We're asked to believe that selling rodent pelts could finance projects that even today would require enormous budgets and heavy machinery. Star-shaped bastions, street layouts, hydraulic structures, all of this is supposedly the result of bartering with indigenous people. By 1660, when the population barely approached 1,000, the city plan already showed perfectly laid out blocks, developed port infrastructure, and solid buildings. Fur traders supposedly created in 30 years what took centuries in Europe. In 1664, the city was captured by the English and renamed New York. Development continued. Shipyards were built, the population grew, and by 1790, there were already 33,000 residents. In 1811, the master plan was approved, giving us the famous rectangular street grid. It all looks like a story of continuous progress and prosperity. However, if we move forward to the second half of the 19th century and look at documentary evidence from that era, instead of a shining metropolis, we see something that completely contradicts the idea of linear development. A city that, according to the official version, was already more than 200 years old appears in a strange, almost post-apocalyptic state, as if it had survived some global catastrophe whose traces had not yet been cleared away. If we turn to the second half of the 19th century and examine documentary evidence, the image of a prosperous metropolis begins to crumble before our eyes. Instead of orderly streets and stone mansions that should fill a city with 2 centuries of history, we see landscapes that look more like the aftermath of a devastating cataclysm. In 1880, daily newspapers began publishing the first printed images of the outskirts and even central areas of Manhattan. And these views are shocking. We see not a city that grew and developed steadily for 200 years, but a chaotic jumble of temporary shacks thrown together from boards and debris. These dilapidated dwellings cling to the tops of bare, clay hills and rocky rises devoid of any vegetation. The land is cut through by deep ravines and ruts, with piles of stone and soil scattered everywhere. There is a strong impression that the ground here was literally turned upside down or dumped by some unknown force. It looks like a disaster zone, or territory after carpet bombing, but certainly not the main city of the United States preparing to enter the 20th century. But the most striking dissonance comes from one detail that completely breaks conventional logic. Amid all this mud, impassable ground, and miserable wooden huts, standing on a crooked, unpaved path, is a perfectly crafted, complex cast-iron gas lamp. This is a high-tech product that requires underground utilities and a centralized gas supply to function. The contrast is unbelievable. People live in near-primitive conditions, in houses that could be blown away by the wind, yet they use infrastructure from a developed civilization. This lone lamp among the ruins looks like an artifact from a past, more advanced culture that survived a catastrophe, while new settlers, the survivors, are forced to huddle in shacks amid the remnants of former greatness. They are not building this city, they are simply occupying empty space, adapting to conditions of devastation. Engravings and photographs from that time capture exactly this moment. Old, powerful infrastructure shows through layers of clay and sediment, while primitive buildings of new inhabitants grow on top like mushrooms. The sense of post-apocalypse deepens when you look at the landscape. Official history speaks of a rocky island, but we see strange earthworks and wastelands that don't resemble natural terrain. It looks more like a buried city being excavated, or, on the contrary, deliberately covered with new layers of soil. It's hard to shake the thought that these people arrived at a place that already existed, had survived some global upheaval, and now they're trying to make a life among ruins whose true nature they may not fully understand. And it's precisely at this moment, when the city was a strange mix of high technology and total ruin, that the authorities decide to launch a project that surpasses all imaginable limits in scale and strangeness. To hide these ruins, level the inexplicable landscape, or finally bury traces of the past, builders and planners begin a massive construction project we now know as Central Park. This project is presented as the creation of a natural oasis, but the methods used resemble a military-style clearance operation. Most people see Central Park as a miraculously preserved piece of pristine nature, green lungs that city planners chose to leave untouched amid concrete jungles. It's a beautiful legend that completely falls apart when you study the construction documents. In reality, the park is an entirely artificial object, created on land where life once thrived. Until the mid-19th century, the future park area was not an empty forest or swamp. It was densely built up. Stone and wooden houses stood there. People lived there. Entire communities functioned. About 2,000 people lived on an area of 3 square kilometers. All of them were forcibly evicted, and their homes were demolished to the ground to make room for what official history calls landscape design. From 1858 to 1873, a colossal construction project unfolded here, the scale of which raises serious doubts about the technical feasibility of carrying it out with the means of that time. The original terrain consisted of complex rocky elevations, mixed with swampy lowlands. Builders were not just planting trees, they were completely reshaping the island's geology. The soil was deemed unsuitable for cultivated plants, so the old ground was excavated and hauled out of the city, and fertile soil was brought in to replace it. Official reports cite a staggering figure. 7 million cubic meters of earth were moved. Think about the logistics. 7 million cubic meters of soil had to be dug up with shovels, loaded onto wooden carts pulled by horses, and hauled along dirt roads that turned into impassable mud in rainy weather. Then, the same volume of new soil had to be brought back. If one cart could carry about 1 cubic meter, that means millions of trips. Such traffic would paralyze any modern metropolis, let alone a 19th century city. In addition, 250 tons of gunpowder were used to level rock formations. Workers literally blasted the granite base of Manhattan, cutting down hills and filling ravines. At the same time, an extremely complex drainage system was laid in the rocky ground. Pipes were installed, and 270,000 trees were planted. We're asked to believe that this titanic volume of earthworks and blasting was done by hand in 15 years. That sounds like a technical absurdity. The speed of landscape transformation and the amount of material moved resemble the work of rotary excavators and heavy trucks more than immigrants with pickaxes and wheelbarrows. It feels like either we're not being told about the real mechanisms used at the time, or the entire story of the park's creation is just a cover for something else. Perhaps the park wasn't created from scratch, but was cleared, hiding traces of earlier development that didn't fit new plans. However, leveling land for the park was only part of a much larger process. If we zoom out, all of Manhattan was undergoing total redevelopment at the time. The island was literally shaved down, destroying its natural relief. Builders removed massive layers of earth, leveling elevation differences. And during this gigantic cutting process, when ground levels were lowered by several meters, objects began to emerge that are even more shocking than the terraforming itself. Beneath layers of soil, structures were found that simply don't fit the official version of a young American city's history. If the scale of Central Park's transformation seems impressive, it's just the tip of the iceberg compared to what happened across Manhattan in the 19th century. The total redevelopment of the city, known as the implementation of the master plan, involved not just laying out roads, but literally destroying the natural terrain. Historical accounts and eyewitness records describe how huge hills simply disappeared, while deep depressions were filled with tons of earth. The island was sliced like a layer cake, erasing its natural geometry to fit an artificial rectangular street grid. Amid this reshaped landscape stood a structure that surpassed all others in monumentality and strangeness: the famous Croton Distributing Reservoir. Officially, this structure, opened in the 1840s, was meant to collect and store drinking water delivered from the Croton River via an aqueduct. But if we set aside textbook bias and look at its architecture objectively, a strong sense of cognitive dissonance arises. This is not a utilitarian urban reservoir, but a cyclopean fortress, as if transported from the age of pharaohs or ancient Babylon. The appearance of this water tank was astonishing. It was a massive stone structure covering a huge area. Its walls, built from enormous granite blocks, reached heights of 15 meters. But the most amazing thing was their thickness. At the base, the walls were about 7 meters thick. Think about that for a moment. 7 meters of solid granite. For comparison, medieval castle walls designed to withstand battering rams and siege engines were often thinner. Why would such colossal strength be needed just to hold water? 19th century engineering was perfectly capable of creating lighter and more economical designs. Yet here we see an excessive margin of strength bordering on absurdity. The reservoir's architectural style raises many questions as well. Sloping outer walls, massive cornices, corner pylons, all of this unmistakably resembles ancient Egyptian temples or Middle Eastern ziggurats. Official sources explain this as a fashion for Egyptian revival. But why would fashion dictate such colossal labor costs? Lifting thousands of tons of granite, shaping it, and laying it in perfect masonry is titanic work. And here we reach the main logical contradiction. Manhattan is a rocky island with hard, stony ground. For a reservoir, it would have been far more logical and cheaper to use the natural terrain. Dig a basin, or use an existing lowland and reinforce its sides. Instead, builders somehow chose to raise the water above ground level, placing it in a gigantic stone bowl built from scratch. This decision looks irrational from a 19th century hydraulic engineering standpoint, unless the structure originally served a completely different purpose. It looks more like a defensive bastion, an ancient citadel, or a technical structure from an unknown civilization that was simply adapted for water storage. The impression is that the reservoir wasn't built, but excavated or restored. Its massiveness and alien character against the backdrop of surrounding wooden and brick buildings only deepen the suspicion. The mystery becomes even more intriguing when we look at the final chapter of this structure's history. At the end of the 19th century, the Croton Reservoir was deemed obsolete and sentenced to demolition to make way for the New York Public Library. And it was during dismantling, when workers began taking apart the granite masonry, that details emerged which completely shattered the idea of a simple water storage tank. Inside the walls and at the base of the structure, elements were found that simply should not be there according to official blueprints. When the massive granite blocks of the Croton Reservoir were dismantled to clear space for the future public library, the internal anatomy of this structure was revealed in all its inexplicable complexity. Instead of a monolithic stone bowl or simple masonry typical of 19th century hydraulic structures, dismantling exposed a complex system of arched vaults and internal chambers. Archival images from the demolition clearly show openings that can only be identified as doorways or passage arches, crafted with the highest level of skill. Particular attention is drawn to the keystones above these openings, the central wedge-shaped elements of masonry that usually crown the top of an arch or vault. Why create architecturally finished entrances with keystones inside a wall that's supposed to simply hold millions of liters of water? These doors lead nowhere, ending in soil or adjacent masonry, as if they were deliberately blocked or buried. This completely contradicts the reservoir's supposed function. A water tank is a sealed container, not a labyrinth with walled-up rooms. The appearance and structural features of these walls strongly resemble ancient fortifications found on the other side of the world. The masonry style, sloping walls, and monumentality closely match surviving sections of the ancient walls of Beijing or old European star forts. If archaeologists found similar ruins somewhere in the sands of the Middle East or the jungles of South America, they would confidently date them to millennia before our era and attribute them to an unknown advanced culture. But because this structure stood in the center of New York, we're simply told it's Egyptian revival, built by contractors with shovels in the mid-19th century. The hypothesis suggests itself. This cyclopean structure was not built in those years. It was most likely excavated, partially restored, and adapted for the needs of a growing city, labeled as a reservoir. This explains the excessive strength, strange architecture, and presence of sealed internal chambers, whose original function was lost. The city simply made use of the legacy of a past, more advanced civilization that survived some cataclysm. This theory is supported by what lies hidden beneath the city streets. New York is riddled with an incredibly complex network of underground utilities, tunnels, and vaulted chambers, whose brickwork quality often surpasses that of above-ground buildings from the same era. Official history tries to convince us that early settlers, or even Native Americans, began creating this underground infrastructure, which sounds completely absurd. It's impossible to imagine people living in wooden houses and trading pelts, simultaneously building underground palaces for sewage or transport, using millions of bricks and high-level engineering calculations. Many of these underground spaces were discovered already finished during subway construction or utility installation. Builders simply stumbled upon old tunnels and incorporated them into new systems. All these scattered facts, from the strange first ship to the granite megaliths of the reservoir and underground labyrinths, stop looking like random coincidences. They form a single, disturbingly logical picture that's carefully hidden behind official dates and names. We're on the verge of realizing that the history of one of the world's most famous cities may be a grand falsification. When we step back and try to take in the entire panorama of New York's official history, we see not a coherent chronicle of development, but a chaotic collection of logical contradictions and technical impossibilities. All the scattered facts we've discussed, when assembled into one picture, scream that we're being told a completely fabricated story. We see a pile of events that physically could not have happened within the stated timeframes and with the stated resources. We're asked to believe a fairy tale where a handful of shipwrecked sailors, with the help of indigenous people who had never seen ocean-going vessels, build an incredibly complex sailing ship in a single winter. Absurd on its own, this story serves as the foundation for further myths. Then we're told about a tiny settlement trading beaver pelts that suddenly finds the resources and manpower to build giant star forts and perfectly planned cities. An economic model where fur trading finances megalithic construction doesn't stand up to any criticism. It's like claiming a modern skyscraper could be built from profits made selling wild berries at a roadside stand. The level of absurdity only grows. In the mid-19th century, when horses were the main source of traction and shovels the primary tool, city authorities supposedly carried out terraforming on a scale comparable to modern mining projects. Moving millions of cubic meters of soil, cutting through bedrock, and creating complex drainage systems are presented as routine park landscaping. But perhaps the clearest evidence of falsification lies in the so-called reservoirs. Massive granite structures with 7-meter-thick walls, arched vaults, and sealed doors that look far more like ancient temples or defensive bunkers than water tanks. Their architecture and excessive strength shout that they were not built to store water, but adapted for that purpose by new masters. All these inconsistencies lead to a single logical conclusion. New York was not built from scratch in the way we're told. The city stands on the foundation of something far older, more powerful, and more technologically advanced. Those we call founding fathers and early settlers most likely arrived at a place that already existed. Perhaps they discovered the ruins of a great civilization that suffered a global cataclysm buried under clay and earth. Their task was not construction, but excavation, restoration, and appropriation of a legacy they did not fully understand. They dug out streets, labeled ancient megaliths as reservoirs, and credited star forts to their own military engineers. The official timeline is just a curtain meant to hide the fact that we live on the remnants of a past whose level of development may have surpassed our own. This version explains everything: strange technologies, the mismatch between resources and results, and tunnels leading nowhere. We are merely tenants in a house we did not build. Realizing this changes our entire perception of reality and forces us to question every word in history textbooks. If this overview made you think and look at familiar things in a new way, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. It helps us search for the truth and break through the walls of official lies. Right now on your screen, you see 2 videos. I won't tell you what they're about, but I guarantee this: once you watch them, you'll never be able to look at official history the same way again. Click and see you there.